Hello, Patrick.
Hey.
The verdict is in on the Canucks season. Um, it's been a while since we haven't done one of these since
Free agency anyway, or
yes, well,
end of
since
season.
the end of the season, free agency, getting out of yourself there. So a lot to kick around. So let's just I know you've written this stuff, and again, people,
Yeah.
we love you watching, we love you listening, we love you reading. Go to theprovince.com, see all of Patrick's stuff immediately following the series. Same with Ben, Steve Ewan. We got a lot of great content there, as we will continue to have. Patrick's in the middle of sort of doing an off-season audit in terms of what we can expect from the roster going forward. But first of all, before we begin on the forward-looking stuff, as a wee friend of ours used to say, before we go forward-looking, let's look back a little bit. That's the series. The way it ended surprised me. The games were all competitive. We know what happened in Game 6. Game 7 at home, I know they got the 2 late goals, but I was just having major deja vu back to the Bruins series. Completely different set of players, like 100% differently, different coach. But the way the series petered out at the end and home advantage for Game 7, what, in your opinion, what happened?
Well, a couple things. I think a little bit of pressure, maybe the situation got to the Canucks. Obviously, like in 2011, dealing with a couple serious injuries. I mean, the Boeser injury, it's tough to survive the loss of any star. But, in the end, this Canucks roster was well assembled, but not, had gaps. And if you took a major piece out, it was going to be really tough to absorb. And the way Brett Boeser had emerged this season as a two-way player, as an excellent, not complimentary, but like 1-2 punch with Miller, the way they were able to, I think, pull up their socks defensively. I mean, look how well they did play against Connor McDavid most of the time. His absence made a lot of knock-on effects. I think Talk had overthought things in the end, setting his lineup. I think he probably should have kept Pius Suter, just made a straight swap up with kept Pius Suter with Miller, made a straight swap up Pettersson for Boeser. The Miller-Pettersson thing did work. Like, they created a lot. And you think about that missed opportunity for Ilya Mikheyev, a couple great chances for Phil Giuseppe as the game went along. In the end, a better finisher. I think Suter probably finishes one of those chances. I mean, it's a what if, right? But at the end of the day, the Oilers came out, they showed more, their best players were better, and it was a lesson. I mean, it was a lesson for the Canucks. They got a long way. The fact that almost everybody, certainly all the observers, said, if you had sort of told me that the Canucks would play a Game 7 against the Oilers in the second round in the playoffs, if you had said that at the beginning of the year, people would be pretty impressed.
Okay,
and
that's
the takeaway. But you're right. Like, in the moment, there was a chance. They had 2 chances to do it, and they couldn't do it, and they failed in both opportunities. And that's the lesson in the end. Is that these games only come along so often, and you just need to find a way. And that's the broader. We've talked about this plenty with Elias Pettersson. That's the lesson for all of them, but especially guys like Pettersson. That no matter what you do, you need to dig deep, and you need to find that extra moment, because the moments run out eventually.
So, I've heard that argument before, like if you go back to expectations at the start of the season, and that's fair enough. It's absolutely 100% accurate comment to make. But if you had also told you at the start of the season that the Canucks would be up 3-2, knowing that they had Game 7 at home, would you have taken a 7-game loss? And the answer would be no. So now, once again, reference our wee friend, where does that lead them in the offseason?
Well, it was good to hear Patrick Allvin talk openly about the thing we all kind of knew in the background, that yes, they need to get a top 6 winger. They know that. And not just because of the Boeser injury, but because they ended up leaning on Ilya Mikheyev far too much. That he had 1 goal in his last 61 games. They had hoped that he could be that kind of complementary piece. He wasn't. And when it became clear long before the playoffs that he was no longer a viable option on Pettersson's wing, that really he was still fine as a defensive player, but in the Pettersson role, Pettersson's a very good 2-way player, but you need to score. And especially if your star player is struggling the way Pettersson was, if you can find someone who can help him get over the line, get back to where he needs to be, no matter what's going on, that's that's the kind of guy you need. And, you know, as sort of quirky as the Oilers' roster setup may be, and the fact that obviously they have two of the best players in the world, they still have options to put with McDavid, to put with Draisaitl. They had Zach Hyman. They had Evander Kane. They had Warren Fogle. They had guys that they could swap around and try to say, this guy can help this guy out. This guy can help that guy out in this way. You know, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Like, they had enough options, whether they was in their sort of top forwards or on the edge of their top forwards. The Canucks just didn't have that. So that's why the lead item being a top six winger is so important. And I think it leads into the overall shopping bag question for their defense. Obviously, they have, you know, four guys who were regulars this season, who are free agents, you know, making decisions, whether it was with Tyler Myers, who clearly wants to come back. The Canucks have to make obviously a cost estimate. It almost, you know, you listen to JP Barry, he was on with Donnie and Dolly on Wednesday, basically saying, yeah, like, he wants to come back. We're going to see where this goes. You get the sense that they recognize that they may not be a July 1 signing, that they need to see what the Canucks do. Nikita Zadorov, obviously, huge fan favorite, huge impact. I mean, the guy did everything he possibly could have done to make himself a hot shot free agent on July 1. I think, you know, the Canucks obviously will want to try to see what they can do to bring him back. But if you are Zadorov and his agent, Dan Muehlstein, you're going to want to hear what other teams have to offer. I think you're just in such a position. You only get these chances so often. Like Dakota Joshua, you know, this is the chance for the big contract. And so, you know, sure, I'm sure the Canucks are going to try, but I would not be shocked to see him as a free agent on July 1. You know, Filip Hronek is the other big question here. A restricted free agent, as he himself noted, is going to surely win a raise in arbitration if he can't just negotiate one. He's in a, you know, the Canucks are in a good position in terms of his rights because he's a restricted free agent. But the player himself, you know, even if he was injured down the stretch or just struggled, which he wanted us to think, but we all know that he was dealing with some kind of elbow injury for a lot of the second half. He had put up enough points and played a ton. Like, the Canucks played him a ton. He could point and say, no matter what you guys might think of my defensive skills, you played me a lot. I played as much as Quinn Hughes, and Quinn Hughes is a Norris Trophy candidate. So he's in a strong position just from a negotiating spot. The Canucks obviously recognize the value of the player. Whether they keep him or they move him on and try to get somebody else, maybe that's how they solve their top six problem. We talked lots about Martin Necas, obviously, a player like that. We'll see. And of course, Ian Cole, I think, is a little bit in the Myers spot. He was a pretty good player for a long part of the season, struggled down the stretch, was fantastic. People forget how fantastic he was against the Nashville Predators. He was a really great player, and then apparently suffered this injury that he didn't really want to get into, but really struggled against Edmonton. So, you know, he is in his late 30s now. Like, that's the reality. You know, the end is coming quickly. I saw enough this season and especially in the playoffs, that told me that he's still a viable, useful player. He made it clear that he would like to come back as well. But, you know, in the end, you have two clear, big stories. I wouldn't be shocked if neither of them is back. I mean, if I had to pick one at this point, it's probably Hronek, but I'm still skeptical that that's the player they want. They have to, you know, obviously make some cap decisions, navigate around that. They don't have a ton coming up. They obviously have Elias Pettersson, who they have big hopes for, but he needs to play some AHL games first. You know, it's not the deepest of pipelines. So, you know, the Canucks they're going to have to reshape this defense. There is no doubt about this. This defense is not going to look the same as it did this year, as it did this past season. Could it look similar? Sure. But the fact that they need guys that can continue to move the puck, that can deal with a rather complicated system that requires a lot of energy, a lot of discipline. It's a challenge. It's going to be a challenging of all the challenges that Patrick Allvin is facing. How he deals with his defense core is the toughest one in front of him.
So I want to ask you about that. Now, you're smarter than me.
I don't know.
Pretty low bar, but no. When we talk about the Canucks and the salary cap, obviously it's a difficult thing to deal with, and they kind of swung for the fences this year, giving up some good assets for, in particular, Elias Lindholm. But ever since we've been doing, even prior to these videos, ever going back with when Ed Willis would join us, when we were doing these things weekly, and we still had Jonathan McDonald in the mix. We were talking about how much the Canucks had to fix their blue line for the whole Jim Benning era.
Yeah.
We went through again, I'm referencing all our old colleagues, Jason Botchford, the fabulous Sea of Granlund's line.
Yeah.
You know, the Steve Pinizzatos of the world that we had to suffer through, the Jake Virtanen high draft pick, looking for this gritty big forward who could chip in offensively. And so I look at it and I know that they're hard pressed, but if you have to give up Hronek, Zadorov, and Joshua, it's almost like one step forward, three steps back, because you know, you say there's not a lot in the pipeline there, but you look at how rare finding those, you know, whether you want to point to Ryan Reeves or going back to Dustin Byfuglien, or, you know, the big guys who can add grit, and he had such amazing chemistry with Connor Garland in particular. But I also think of, like, it's one thing to play in the regular season, but as you're talking about the learning curve in the playoffs, Joshua was very good. I dare say Zadorov was great. I know they're hard pressed because of the dollars you've got to Hughes, Pettersson, Miller in particular. But is there, in your mind, if they were to get creative, is it possible to bring one, two, probably no way to get three, but are there ways that they could bring back, say, Joshua and Zadorov?
Yeah, I think that scenario is very reasonable. I think, you know, Joshua, one of the other things we saw that was clear is that, you know, they need two top six wingers. It's not just one, especially if you're looking at the likes of Pius Suter. I think Pius Suter's reality is he needs to be your third center. As good as the Suter, Miller, Boeser line was, you need to find someone up. Maybe that is Dakota Joshua. Maybe he can find a way he grew his game so much. I mean, he's pretty much going to be what he developed into by the end of the season, but maybe he's a guy
that's going to get a big raise.
Right? I mean, you know, and he's going to get a pretty solid raise. To me, Joshua is an obvious priority to resign, even if it's going to be a little bit more than maybe the Canucks would like. He's a guy that did enough this season that shows that he's got a little more in him for at least a couple seasons here. He is in an interesting spot. He is in that sort of low end of the middle class forward who struggle to get paid. Like, that's the other thing. You know, you go to free agency, it's not like the old days. A guy like him in the old days would have gotten a huge payout. Those kinds of deals are less and less. Now, this summer does have we're expecting a lot of activity, whether it's trades or it's free agency, just because the cap's going up. There's a lot of contracts across the league that are coming off. Teams are going to be able to reset their rosters in a way that we haven't seen for really since before the pandemic. And I think that more than anything is the sort of underlying story to all this is, how does all that shake out for guys like Joshua, for guys like Zadorov? Like, where is their actual value? Zadorov, realistically, for the Canucks, shouldn't be playing more than sort of third line minutes. He was in a third line role on this team. So how much do you really want to pay a guy like that? You know, Joshua, if you're going to pay him $3 million, you know, he clearly turned himself into a third liner. That is what a third liner makes, right? Like, it's not a super complicated thing here. Do the Canucks think he can repeat it the way he did this year? There is certainly a way to have two of those players back. I'm sort of assuming here, obviously, that Elias Lindholm is not back, that he's just going to go end up getting a payout because he plays center and had a good playoff. And I think the Canucks know. I think the Canucks know that underneath that, like, he produced well, but he wasn't quite the two-way force that they want him to be, especially behind Elias Pettersson. I mean, Pettersson didn't do much offensively, but he wasn't a problem defensively. He had a couple horror shifts that we can all think about, but on the whole, he was his usual solid self defensively. So, they needed Lindholm to be a pretty safe bet in not terribly tough minutes, and he struggled with that as a defender. He scored. That's going to help him get a payout. I just don't know if the Canucks are really going to want to go there.
So when you look at, and I've, I don't want to tell tales out of school, but I've had some history with some of the Canuck GMs in the past in terms of the dealings with the media. But I've been a very big admirer of the job that Jim Rutherford and Patrick Alvin have done.
Right.
The front office, I think, has got this you maybe were expecting longer to get over the hump from what we have experienced the last 7 years, but I think that they took this big leap. So I do have faith that they can maneuver a little bit here. In your mind, what is the more likely scenario for them to try and I haven't looked too closely at the free agent class coming up. In your mind, though, what is the more likely path for them? Bigger trades, free agent signings? It's tough to know, right? You've got the dominoes have to fall in the order you want them to, and it's hard to get into their mindset. But what kind of if you play GM, Patrick, what do you envision happening a little bit?
Well, I mean, they were hot after a top six winger. They did. These are moves they didn't do, but we knew they were certainly interested in adding a defenseman. They were certainly interested in adding another forward. We know about the forward. Chris Tanev. They got close. They got close to a guy like Tyler Toffoli. The obvious ones are obvious. Just to steal a phrase. You're right. Like how they get there, I do wonder if they'll try to pull off a trade. Patrick Allvin certainly has had big discussions from what I've understood over the past couple seasons. Never, he hasn't quite pulled off any of the huge big swings that he's talked about. But it would not shock me if he finds a way to do that. Even if you just look at, for the short term, they don't draft till the third round in this draft, right? Like they don't have third rounders in each of the next two drafts.
That's the problem 3 years from now, Patrick.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. So, is there a way if he's looking for some kind of impact? Your draft picks really are what your literal currency, right? Like the Canucks, I think more and more have become of the opinion that late picks just aren't worth it anymore. And so what can you do with those? What can you do for other teams or how can you help other teams get where they want to get to? Can they find a way to pick up second round pick? Getting a first rounder seems extreme, and I'm not quite sure it's what they would be after, given they know that they have. I mean, you have to look at the window now. Like they've got 3 years more. Quinn Hughes under contract. Brock Boeser is a free agent next summer. We maybe forgotten about that in all the realities of where he's been. But Brock Boeser will be an unrestricted free agent next summer. And given how he's played, it's hard to imagine, him not trying to force that. He's in a position of strength all of a sudden after having a couple difficult seasons. The Canucks are in an interesting spot. Like, how much do they try to go in for this year? How much can they actually go in for this year? When you consider the Boeser question, to me, it is going to be interesting. I expect them to be aggressive. Like, Allvin has not shown himself to be shy to try things out, try picking up players. He, think the last season he picked up Riley Stillman and then turned around and traded him again. He picked up Anthony Beauvillier and turned around and traded him again. He has seen a through line of value in all his trades that is interesting if you step back and consider it. He's made a couple of misfires in free agency, but on the whole, there's been a pretty good series of results in adding positive value in every move you make. So, you sit back, it is that Moneyball thing. How do you recreate all this in the aggregate? Well, it's probably not re-signing the guys you already have. It's probably finding the next version of Dakota Joshua, finding an underrated Nikita Zadorov, on and on and on. But we'll see how it shakes out.
Who knew flippers would prosper in Vancouver?
Yeah. Shocking, right?
It's I do want to ask you about this, though. It's something we've sort of talked about amongst ourselves in the last week or so. And I don't want to relitigate the Jim Benning era, although you kind of have to on an ongoing basis in terms of what they have in the pipeline, so to speak. But if you do look at really what the strategy was to say that, Hughes and Pettersson needed this veteran leadership in the room, and that's why they overspent on some of these free agents to maybe let these guys understand what winning was all about. And yet all we heard after the fact with Pettersson, and Hughes did not have a bad playoff for sure, and he was targeted and he was beat up, but he didn't have the impact that if you looked at his regular season numbers, you might expect. Certainly even one timely goal from him could have changed that series. But if you do look at that, where is the leadership of this team? Like, And not to just be negative though, this is a real thing with sports. Like younger players, like Hughes, like Hoglander, like Pettersson's still relatively young. This experience does mean a lot, and they will get better. So the core that they have, like what we lament all the stuff that they lose, the core that they have will be better for this experience. So you expect them to take a step. But really, what does it say about the leadership of this team that, maybe there was a bit of a void there? Not with the young guys. I want to be clear. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying the strategy to tutor these guys in the ways of being able to survive the playoffs didn't seem to come together.
Well, I think the thing that was interesting to watch in all this was the emergence of that JT Miller. Like he found a way that it clearly became a case of that, obviously winning helps everything, right? And in the midst of all this, he found an edge to walk along that was loud, that was boisterous, that was true to himself, but that didn't get you thinking, oh, he's being a real asshole to these guys, right? Like that was always the knock on him. This guy's a jerk. This guy doesn't, blah, blah, blah. And he told it to me when I wrote that little story about him mid-playoff, that he said Rick Tocchet and Adam Foote and Sergei Gonchar helped him find essentially a better version of himself. And he became, in many ways, the emotional leader of this team. Quinn Hughes is the guy that's going to get it done. He's going to lead you into the fight. He is that quintessential show don't tell leader, right? Like he gets it done by his actions, and that's important. And at the same time, having Miller as that sort of emotional counter punch, like he was really important to this team. He can't be everything, right? The team still has to have motivation in itself, and that brings us to the third of the Musketeers, which would be Elias Pettersson. They need him to find a way to get himself reset emotionally. He doesn't have to be, all happy fuzzy with his teammates, but he does need to have a sort of an ability to draw them further, take them further than they knew they could get. And the factor is in all this is that they needed more in the end from their best player, from their best forward, and they didn't get it. And that's now the challenge in front of him. And that's the challenge in front of Rick Tocchet, is finding a way to connect with this guy. Because, Pettersson wants to be the best player. He's a guy that looks at himself and looks at the best players around the NHL and says, I'm in the same tier as them, and I want to be in the same tier as them. Well, to get there, he's going to have to find something new. And that's now on Tocchet. That's maybe that's on some of his teammates. I don't know. That's on him, obviously, most importantly. But for this team to take a true step forward, no matter what else happens, that's what they need to see to go. You asked us earlier, what has happened this summer? Well, Elias Pettersson has to A, rediscover himself, and B, find a way that he can be even better than we've seen. Like last year, let's not forget how great he was last year. He was a 100-point player. Like that wasn't an accident. He was on top of the world in January and fell off the face of the earth. And that needs to be figured out, whether it was because he was dealing with some sort of knee injury, because he lacked in confidence, whatever it was, he needs to find a way to battle through and be more, because the Canucks needed him to be more. And that's going to be a question that's simply going to be hanging over him going into next year and until, basically get to the playoffs next year, and we can see what he does in the next installment.
Well, we could probably go on for another hour, but we've got weeks to fill on this. So we're going to continue to do these every week, and we'll do some special ones in particular around the draft, free agency, and everything else. So Patrick, thanks for your insight. Thanks to everyone for listening. Sign up for Canuck Report. You get all our Canuck content, our Canuck newsletter, theprovince.com, vancouversun.com. It's all there. Great job this season, Patrick. These have been fun. It's been great interacting with the readers on this, and listeners, viewers, whatever you want to call them. And, you're guilty as charged on all counts of doing a great job this year.
Thanks, Paul.